So what I'm going to do, so what I'm going to talk about today is pretty much give a sort of update as to what's changed with respect to what we know about climate change more recently, how we think it's affecting the natural world using a couple of examples, and discuss a little bit about where we're going with this, both in terms of COP26, which is obviously very, very recent, but also what I would say is a way out of this mess. So that's the outline structure. So first of all, what is climate change? Well, hopefully most of this isn't going to be news to you, but there have been some updates from the latest IPCC report, and I'm also going to set it in the context of something that happened last weekend, Storm Arwen. So this is what a lot of people call a hockey stick graph, and what it shows is the temperature for every year since the Industrial Revolution started kicking off in earnest. So obviously you've got time on the x-axis, and what you've got is relative temperature on the y-axis. And as you can see, as we start to get towards the mid-20th century, those bars start turning red as the temperatures get higher and higher above average. This is actually one of the graphs that's been used to define the start of the Anthropocene, being the mid-20th century. Some people say 1970, some people say 2000, but anyway, the fact that climate change is really starting to take hold now is certainly one of the fixtures of what we're going to be dealing with as geographers throughout the 21st century. So 2020 is a calendar year. As you can see there, 0.92, which wasn't quite the warmest on record, warmest year on record, that is. And 2021 is looking like it's probably going to make the top 5 as well. So just some selected data from this year to expand on that. You might not have thought it was a particularly warm summer this year, but for large parts of Northumberland where I live, the northeast of England, and particularly the West Highlands, it really was 2 degrees above average in parts. And I thought it would be quite interesting. We've seen the Californian wildfires and droughts in the news a lot. There's a live map of drought conditions for the continental US, and I thought I'd bring that up to see if things have returned to normal yet. They haven't. Still large parts, particularly Southern California, that are under exceptional drought conditions. So although most of those wildfires have been put out, there's still quite a lot to be done on a short-term basis there. Amazing to think that we're after Thanksgiving and approaching Christmas now, and that is still the case. So it's clear the direction we're going. What is causing us to get there? And again, this may not be news, but it's always good to return to these things. With the Industrial Revolution and what's happened since, one of the byproducts of that literally are greenhouse gases. And as those gases have climbed steeply, what they've obviously done is helped to trap outgoing long-wave radiation, which is an enhanced greenhouse effect, as we know. And that has led to these increases in temperature, but also changes in precipitation as well. I'll talk a bit about those in a second. It was originally mainly as a result of what you see in the bottom left-hand corner, which is industrial processes, point source emissions. But what we're now seeing in the global north and increasingly elsewhere is that transport is now forming the biggest chunk of the emissions from these sorts of countries. And that's, you know, we should point out that that's largely due to progress that industry and to a certain extent governments have made in reducing their emissions from factories, from power stations and places like that. How do we know this is true? Well, I could make the whole talk just about how we produce this graph, which is separating out the natural forcings of climate. We call them forcings. These are influences on the Earth's temperature, and separating those out from the human influences like greenhouse gases. And all the science behind how we do that is expressed in climate models, and the results of those we call simulations. So they're a bit like video games where you can put the natural and the human in, or just one or the other. So if you just take the models and just do all the natural influences on climate, you can't reproduce those increases in temperature that we've seen in some of the previous graphs, only if you include the greenhouse gases, and that's very important. And so what we can then do is take those models and ask, just do a thought experiment and say, okay, well, what if things continue as they are? And this is something that's called a plume plot. It's a bit like a weather forecast over the very long term. And as you can see here, this is pretty much where we are now, but we are committed to a level of warming no matter what we do. But the envelope, call this maybe the envelope of uncertainty, is quite large, and we could end up with sort of 2 or 3, 4 degrees of additional warming above where we already are. And so that's why we're still doing global negotiations on climate to try and get towards the blue line and get away from the red line. But it's not just about temperature. And to illustrate that, well, I'm sure you might have your own stories about this, but this is my back garden after Storm Arwen. I'll just show you. It's not a very long clip. You can see the roofs in the background, sort of ripped off to the eaves there. Don't know whose Wendy house that is. Fortunately, those are my neighbour's roof tiles. Fortunately, my board was okay, but it did move around quite a lot. Didn't dare go out and get it. Don't know whose dustbin that is. So that was on the morning after Storm Arwen. And it's very, very important that we point out we can never attribute an individual storm directly to human-caused climate change. But what we can do is start to work out how likely these sorts of events are, given what we've done to the world's weather systems. So just to put Arwen in a bit more context and why this is important, it's not just about Wendy houses, and dare I say it, even roof tiles, even though that's expensive. You know, ecologically, tens of thousands of trees across the north of England and into Scotland have been uprooted. And we had various effects of the wind and the waves on coastal areas as well. If you think about some of the storms we've had recently, this can run into billions of pounds in the wrong place at the wrong time. And what that means is we're kind of entering an era where storms may have previously been an annoyance and tragically sometimes causing some loss of life, but we're moving into an era where these are becoming far more likely. And obviously, when you're losing tens of thousands of trees at a time, that's having quite a profound impact on, well, both natural systems, but also the humans that rely on them as well. So if we take a look at storms like Arwen, like for example, like a 10-year heavy rainfall event, you can look at them in two ways. You can look how often they're going to occur, which is the frequency, and how strong they are, how intense they are. So, for example, an event that occurred 1 in every 10 years previously, already at the moment, they're now 30% more likely, okay? So 1.3 times more likely to occur. And they're, 6.7% wetter. But as we move up that graph, that plume plot towards these future warming scenarios, as you can see, like we're going to be living with them far more frequently. So they're going to do more damage when they arrive. They're going to have more effect, and they're going to occur more often. So it's not just about temperature. And in fact, when it comes to what we do about this, how we respond, we're going to be just as worried about these extreme events as the slow ratchet of the temperature increase. I could have given the whole talk just about the physical science behind this, but I will give a hat tip to the new IPCC report that came out a couple of months ago, maybe 3 months ago now, that gives a lot more detail under these things. One of the headline conclusions, particularly about the future climate, is that it's now more likely than not we're going to exceed 1.5 degrees. There's a new report, incidentally, on the impacts of climate change due in February. So if you are very interested in the state of the art, that's definitely the first place to go for these sorts of things. But yeah, what I thought I would do is also go on to talk a bit about what this means for the natural world. In full acknowledgement that obviously when it interacts with towns and cities, it does a lot of damage, but we're also interested in how it affects things for the plants and animals that we rely on for lots of the things we do on the planet, the food we eat, right down to things like flood risk, mitigating flood risk, reducing flood risk, things like that. And so at the heart of this, it might not be hugely obvious how pivotal climate and the weather is for the natural world. But I hope that by showing you these two maps at the top of the screen, that brings it home just how important it can be. So in the top left-hand corner, what you've got on that global map there is the annual mean temperature for every part of the world. Obviously the white, purpley areas are the poles, which are very cold, and Antarctica is very, very cold indeed. And you've got those bright red areas of the tropics and the subtropics. You can also spot, if you look quite closely, the way that the UK and Northwest Europe gets a bit of a benefit from having the Gulf Stream arriving from North America. You can see that red dipping far further north than it would otherwise. Keeps us a bit warmer than the average for our latitude. But if you look at the top right-hand corner, that is the total annual precipitation, which doesn't quite look as regular as the temperature map. This is a function of proximity to coast and topography, as well as things like distance from the equator this time. So the wettest places aren't always immediately predictable based on your latitude. And in fact, you can draw a line across that graph and find really some of the driest deserts on Earth alongside some of the wettest places as well. But if you take those two, combine them, what you get is a map that's not far off the major global biomes on the planet. And of course, where you've got those biomes, you've got the typical habitats that underlie them, whether it's a rainforest, a savanna, or a desert. And then that tells you what species of plants and animals that you get there. And so, of course, you're probably already making the link with the changes in temperature and precipitation that we're expecting. We're also expecting that bottom map to change as well. If you're interested in reading a bit more about this, I promise it's pretty jargon-free, but there's a chap called John Lawton that wrote a brilliant essay on how actually one of the most fundamental things that defines ecology, which is what you find and where biologically in the world. He makes a really good argument for why thermodynamics is one of the major drivers of ecological patterns and processes, alongside evolution, of course. So to understand this and unpack this in a bit more detail, I'll just explain a bit more about species geographic range, and I'm going to talk about what I know, which is butterflies. I work on butterflies a lot. And so behind that map at the bottom of the previous slide, those habitats are a function of all the different, predominantly plants, but also animals that live in that place. And every single one of those has what we'd call like a geographic range over which it can survive. And that range can be defined by a few things, but one of the main drivers of species geographic ranges is the temperature gradient and moisture gradient. And just taking the temperature gradient as an example here, you can actually, surprisingly, you can find butterflies in a wide range of conditions. You've got a monarch butterfly that's survived quite a hard frost on the left-hand side there, adult butterfly, still doing okay. You've got a comma butterfly in the middle there that's kind of got its, in this sort of Goldilocks scenario, this temperature is just perfect for it. It's perfectly happy, it's feeding on nectar. And you've got a Western swallowtail on the right there that's actually doing a good job of surviving in desert conditions. But on the left and on the right there, both those individuals are probably at the outer limits of what they can tolerate, either when it's too cold or too hot. And what the curve in the middle there indicates, that looks a bit like a Gaussian curve, a normal distribution you might have covered in maths. What you're basically looking at is the closer to the middle of the tolerance range, that's where you find more individuals of those species. So the curve is measuring how often you encounter that species. And once it gets into the yellow, the physiological stress, it can potentially tolerate those sorts of conditions, but it might be a fleeting visit, or it might only be at certain times of the year, of the season, of the day even, like the desert butterfly might only appear mornings and evenings and retreat at other times when it's too hot or too cold. So, so that's the setup. And obviously, like I say, these sorts of things are going to be affected by climate change. In the UK, I thought I would show a map a bit like the global map, but just for the UK now, so I can illustrate what I'm about to show you. That's the mean temperature of every part of the UK. You can see that the upland areas, which are mainly Scotland, the north of England, are blue and sometimes deep blue. And the lowland areas, are mainly red, ranging to deep red. But there's no doubt there's a difference between the north and south as well, because the lowland parts of the north of Scotland are still cooler than the lowland parts of England and south of England. So actually, when we take this temperature gradient, it looks a bit more like this. So where you've got the north is at the top of that graph, and the south is at the bottom where it's too warm. And so what you might expect, given that temperature gradient, is with climate change occurring over the whole of the UK, and in fact, it's pretty much warmed in every single grid square in every location on the planet now, to varying degrees, no pun intended. What you'd expect for a species that is constrained by temperature, limited by the temperatures it can survive in, is that they've expanded into new areas as the whole island has gotten warmer. And that is what you see. So in the right-hand map, what you've got is the extent what the species occurred in from 1970 to 82. That's when the species was mapped for the distribution atlas. That's why those years are a bit strange there. And the orange records are all the additional records that we found for that species in that 5-year period. And it didn't occur there in that 70 to 82 atlas. So this is a species, this Polygonia sea album, that has really expanded into new places due to climate change. And that includes large parts of the northeast, of course. And you might ask how we know this. How do we make beautiful maps like this that tell us what's going on with climate change? Well, the answer is the general public are absolute heroes for us in this, because they send in all their records either via mobile apps, or they write all the records down of what they see and where, and they send them in to wildlife conservation charities, you know, whether it's butterflies, ants, plants, all sorts, you name it, people send them in. And that can help us map the distributions of species all over the UK. And to show you how many records they send in, I am going to play you a video, a short video of all the records we receive in the different groups. So invertebrates, vertebrates, fungi, plants, or other groups of species. So if you just watch this species, so we start in January, all those kind of explosions are people sending in records, and you can see the map start to fill up as we get coverage from different parts of the UK. And as any ecologist knows, the world is ruled by insects, which is why that graph is turning blue, and that the insects are going off the chart now. Things get a bit quieter in November, December, particularly in the northern half of Britain. And it's because of these hundreds of thousands of records per annum that we can map species in so much detail. And so what happens if you take all those records and work out, like the map for the comma, where everything is moving? Well, what you get, if you group them by the different groups, the taxa, we call them, we do find that they are moving north quite a lot. The different colours of the bars are just different ways of calculating the range shift, but the conclusion is most of them have moved 50 to getting on for 100 kilometres in the past sort of 30 to 40 years, which is remarkable. The reptiles and amphibians are the one group that probably respond far more directly to human pressure and, dare I say it, persecution, which is one of the reasons they're doing the opposite to the rest. But overall, it gives us really good evidence that something is happening. But there are places and wildlife sites and species that can be really difficult to find. And they can be up mountains, they can be in quite remote locations, and they tend to be under-captured by citizen scientists. And so we need a plan for those species as well. So you can see some of these species are quite obviously cold adapted. These ptarmigan in the bottom right hand corner. Top left is a mountain ringlet butterfly, mountain hare as well, some of the mountain plants, Arctic alpine plants. So we need to do specialist surveys for those, and this is the very, very short bit of the talk that I'm just going to talk about a research project that I was involved in. This was to map the distributions of the Scotch Argus butterfly, which is one of the species a bit like the ones you saw on the previous slide. This was with a big team of people from lots of different institutions, and actually we had a team of 8 to 10 of us working 3 months for 2 summers. We drove thousands and thousands of miles trying to track down this butterfly and 3 others a bit like it. And what we were doing was walking what's called a belt transect, which is a survey method which you just look either side of a simple route around a 1 by 1 kilometre square. And what we did was we returned to records that people had sent in previously, all in a big bang, all in one go, to try and work out, were those species still there? Had they changed their distribution? Because if this is a cold dwelling species, maybe it's disappearing from some of the warmer sites in its range. And yeah, we went to over 100 sites for this species, 100 populations, and they were all identified before 2000. So of course, this is a bit like before 15 or 20 years of climate warming. And what we found was that it was much more likely to have gone extinct from the bottom of its range, from the south of its range. So all the little grey circles there are all the known sites for the species. And each of the pies is sized based on how many sites we visited in that area. So that just illustrates where the density of sites is, as well as the, the absolute numbers. And so you can see these, for these southern pies, there's quite a few more orange sites there. Whereas the green, which is persist throughout the study, they're probably the coolest sites that we have. Turnover are sites where there is reasonable evidence that there's been a change, like a fluctuation in the population. So we think that's somewhere in the middle between a long-term extinction and a long-term persistence. So yeah, we think it retreated about 200 kilometers north since 1999. Huge, much more than some of the other bars on the graph, which is interesting because most of those species were probably range expanders. This is a range retracting species, so there's a bit of an inequity between the two. And given that the retracting species are harder to survey, harder to get good data on, we might be underestimating just how strong climate change effects can be. And so I think the point and one of the key messages there is that wildlife can't always keep up with climate change. And what we can do is we try to say, okay, well, given what we already know about all the ranges that species can exist in, given what we're expecting for climate change by 2050, what is the associated risk of global extinction we're talking about now for species? And what we're saying is we think something of the order of 15 to 37% of species not necessarily will have disappeared by 2050, but will be committed to extinction. So they'll already be entering a situation, like I said, about increased physiological stress or more, that means that sooner or later that population is going to go. Okay, and actually, just to point out, that study was the first of many on looking into this. But what I find quite interesting since then is we are starting to report extinctions due to climate change. This was the first mammal, and it's known as the bramble-K melamis, or mosaic-tailed rat. And it existed on a very, very small coral formed K. This is the Torres Strait. So that huge chunk of land is Papua New Guinea, which is actually obviously, the closest bit of New Guinea to Australia. And you have lots of these coral Ks, and with them, quite a few endemic species. So this was a species endemic to a very, very small island. And actually, it wasn't that slow ratchet of temperature. That was inundation due to a storm caused by sea level rise. So sea levels are getting higher, and particularly so in that part of the world. And then eventually that storm that came along, that extreme event, was the thing that finally took the rest of those populations away. So that is now extinct. So things are starting to happen as we thought they would. So good point to ask the question, what can we do about this? And I did think I'd put in a little bit about COP26 because it is so topical and it's happened so recently. So first of all, a quiz. Who said this? I've been hearing all about COP. I still don't know who's coming. It's very irritating when they talk, but they don't do. So answers in the chat. Who do you think said that? A little bit of fun. Now, strictly looking at this from a conservation point of view, there are a few things that we can do on the ground to try and help species. We can do a better job of assessing the risks to them than we do already. That looks at how exposed species are, how sensitive they are, because some of them aren't that sensitive to climate, and how much might they be able to adapt, so on and so forth. We can join up habitats, connect them, make them better, make the landscape look better for species. But ultimately, even if that's not going to help, we could potentially move them around. And actually, it's amazing how much people are taking that sort of a question more seriously than even 5 or 10 years ago. When I was doing my PhD, it was seen as an outrageous thing to even suggest, whereas now it's becoming quite commonplace to discuss these sorts of projects. And of course, it's happening for real. We could expand the areas we protect as well, because we know that protected areas help species respond to climate change as well. And we could also reduce the other threats. So places like the Wye Valley, good example of this. It's a huge amount of nitrogen deposition going on, that if we actually tackled that threat, then species would be a bit more resilient to another threat that's coming down the line, which is climate change. The other thing we've got to decide, unfortunately, as well, is what are the are there any species that we can't save? And for some of those, you know, there are 10 pairs of ringoozle birds on Dartmoor, and that's the coldest place for many miles around. You sort of sometimes got to ask and answer the difficult questions as well. And for some species, it's going to be the case of there's not actually anything we can do to sort of protect them as well. So I would say that for all these options, the things to the further right you go, the more expensive they become, or the more the public has to be engaged as to the reasons why that may be. So but that's really quite a narrow look at nature conservation itself, but there's more we can do about this, and this is about more than just the physical kind of management on the ground. And this is where COP26 comes in, because what we need to do at a more global level, given that climate change is a global issue, is consider nature and nature's role in all this in a bigger way. And given that you've already been listening to me for half an hour and that we're at the end of the day, I thought I would discuss this in a slightly more light-hearted way in terms of memes. Now, you all probably know what a meme is. Things like the Leonardo DiCaprio on the left there. Here's to all the memes that make us smile. Distracted boyfriend on the right. People tend to annotate pictures that people are already familiar with. They sort of plug into your knowledge of that picture or that meme and kind of put across what it is that they're trying to communicate. Before we get into how we're going to build our meme about nature and humans and what we do about this, I'm going to show you a video of iguana versus snake, and a quick trigger warning for those with snake phobia. This is one of my best moments of any BBC wildlife documentary.
A near miraculous escape.
So that's a typical understatement there from someone who we should probably refer to as God. What I find amazing about that clip, aside from being very exciting, is this is the sort of personification of nature to the extreme. You've got an iguana actually kicking a snake off it. You've got a good guy, a bad guy, you've got everything. And actually, this is quite a common approach to getting the world to think about nature and think about us sort of doing what we can to help natural systems. I mean, in some cases, in things like National Geographic, they're saying, okay, look at all this amazing imagery, irreplaceable, fragile ecosystem language there, right through to having things that we can empathize with in the logos. and then, the amazing natural history unit of the BBC. So that was one example of many where they tell a story about the natural world to get you engaged, to get you interested, and hopefully to get you to care. But one thing all these approaches have in common really is to reinforce an idea of nature in your eyes as some sort of victim or thing that this is happening to. And that's quite important, as I'll talk about in a second. The first thing I'm going to do is introduce our meme. And so to do this, I have taken an illustration of a play called Under the Gaslight, which was by Augustin Daly, written in 1867. And already this might be a scene that's fairly familiar to you. In fact, it's been copied and parodied many times since. There's one notable exception there. Actually, the main protagonist is a woman who saves a man who's tied up on the train tracks. Subsequently, that's been changed, but that's certainly a myth that we need to bust. But yeah, the setup is pretty clear. You've got a steam train coming down the tracks, you've got a hero, and you've got a victim. And here's my first stab at our meme, which is to say, okay, well, like in the nature documentaries, but like in lots of other things, we sort of see nature as a victim tied up on the tracks. And we humans there are coming to save nature from climate change or other environmental crises. And I would say that is some of the story, but not all the story. And actually, there are many ways in which nature actually offers some of the solutions to the sorts of problems that I talked about earlier. I'm going to give you two examples, and some of the ways that I think that a reframing of this would really help us in terms of how we're doing the global climate negotiations, but also in your heads, how you're talking about it as well, whether that's a geography A level or just out in your lives. So the first one I'd like to talk about is our program, our coordinated program to re-wet the uplands. Because a long time ago, and up to fairly recently, we were trying to dry the uplands out, either to farm them or more commonly to extract peats. And this was very important, this latter one, because we used it to heat our homes. So let's not underestimate how important that is. But obviously now we're in a situation where these areas are dried out, like in the photo in the top right-hand corner. We've got these big areas of bare peats, and unfortunately, they emit greenhouse gases. So this is on a hill above where I grew up in Manchester, and there are large parts of the uplands that still look like this. And that's actually true worldwide. It's a process that's gone on in all parts of the world. And actually, it's so important that it accounts for 5% of our emissions. And then you get secondary effects as well. So when a storm like Arwen comes along, the rainfall runs off the hills very quickly, and that causes problems downstream in terms of discoloration, in terms of the speed at which the water runs off the hills. So what could nature do about this? Well, the UK does have a plan for this. I would say we should be aiming to restore more of these peatlands and re-wet them so that they don't emit the greenhouse gases. To put it into context, The UK target is to restore 280,000 hectares, which is about 300 to 350,000 football fields. Sounds a lot. We could do a lot more. But if we re-wetted all the peatlands, what would actually happen is they'd start to become a sink for the greenhouse gases and not a source. So you're not only reducing your emissions, you're saying we're going to actually absorb some from ourselves or elsewhere as well, which is just could be hugely valuable. And what happens when you turn bare, dry peat, like we saw in the first photograph, to the dammed peat, like you see in the photograph in the top right now? Well, the peat discharge goes down by about 30% in the associated rivers in the catchment. And just as crucially, it's slowed down by 20 to 30 minutes. And that gives the local environment agencies or other authorities a chance to respond. And also places like Hebden Bridge, it gives people a chance to actually do something about it and defend their homes, which could be really important. My second example is tree planting, sometimes called afforestation, if there haven't been trees there before, or reforestation for areas that have had trees. To be very clear, I'm not talking about any areas with any depth of peat at all. We should always just restore those areas rather than plant trees on them, because that can be completely maladaptive, we call it, like a bad thing to do about climate change. So situation at the moment, well, about 13% of Britain is woodland. The forest cover pretty much hit a historical low around the sort of First World War, Second World War, and it's slowly increased since, but it's still very low internationally. Don't take my word for it. Look at the satellite image on the top right. You can see we're sort of well behind others that are in the sort of northwestern, even northwest Europe, let alone places like Sweden and Norway. So the other thing to note about it is the tree stock we do have, any emissions that are absorbed, any greenhouse gases that are absorbed by the trees, the potential of those is based on how old the trees are. And because our trees are getting older, the potential of them to lock in things like CO2 is declining. So we need to increase what we have. And one of the reasons that we are so prone to flooding in certain areas, particularly in urbanized areas around the hills in the north of Britain, north of England, is they were cleared of forest previously. So they used to be forest, and now they're not. So what could we have? Well, at the moment, the target is about 0.1% of the UK land area per annum. And whilst we need the right trees in the right place, clearly we're going to need to be slightly more ambitious than that if it's going to make a meaningful contribution. So Royal Society estimate something like 13% of the land area to double the amount that we sequester. You know, the other point to note is the flooding benefit. So even if that percentage area isn't quite 13%, if it's well targeted, we can do a huge amount to attenuate flooding as well, in this context as well. So hedgerows, shelter belts can reduce the flow peaks by 40%, we reckon. It depends on the catchment, as always, but this is what we'd call like a win-win. So you've got emissions reduction, overall emissions reduction, and flooding, reducing the risk of flooding as well. So that's what it could look like. So this meme, coming back to it, should look a bit more like this. We, the humans, the more we look at environmental crises, the more we slowly realize that it's actually working with nature that will get us out of them. So nature's the protagonist, it's the potential to save us from ourselves and these environmental crises that are almost wholly down to us. But it doesn't quite stop there, because what I'd actually also argue is that nature has a role to play for many other crises in the world, not just environmental ones. And if you're less persuaded by that, I will give you the example of global pandemics, something that is pretty topical at the moment. This is a flow chart of the best guess as to the emergence and spillover of zoonoses that you may or may not know that some of the other major zoonoses that aren't coronavirus also have their origins in the natural world. Don't take these arrows to be absolute certainty about how they emerged, but more the best explanation we have as to why. And when you see a chart like this, I don't know about you, but what this tells me is that if we sorted out our relationship to the natural world, and for example, like down in the bottom there, those are wildlife markets, wildlife trade, we'd probably do a better job of at least monitoring and hopefully reducing the risk of them spilling over into human populations, like on the right hand side, and sort of start to get a handle on what on earth is going on. When you start to look across, this is a Venn diagram of emerging infectious diseases more generally, where they come from, where they occur, whether it's in human populations, wildlife populations, or domestic animals. The examples you see, like the light green ones to the right-hand side, all the major players are in that human-wildlife overlap, or like influenza A, can move between populations almost at will. The ones that are solely domestic animal human, we tend to have a grip on, relatively speaking, but who could predict? And all these arrows that shows how each particular pathogen moves within that Venn diagram. A lot of these are geographical problems and problems of ecology and how we manage our relationship to the natural world. So some food for thought there. And there are others, mental health crisis, people with greater exposure to the natural world tend to report fewer episodes of mental ill health. Got global displacement of peoples, far more common in areas with environmental crises too, particularly unmanaged ones. So if you want to hear a bit more about what I think about this, I actually just today put up a blog post about it with the British Ecological Society. That URL's on the last slide as well. So before we finish, who said this? Been hearing all about COP. I still don't know who's coming. Sound a bit grumpy, don't they? That was Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth, in the run-up to COP26.
So Janica got it right, although the other options were Prince Charles, so close, just one generation down.
Oh, not bad, not bad. I wonder what she thinks about what actually happened there.
Indeed.
So thank you very much for coming along today. Do ask a question, please do.
Thanks, Andy.
Got that blog post online, and yeah, keep engaging with us as a uni, as an association. keep conversation going, because I think this sort of thing is really fascinating.
Andy, thank you very much for that fascinating and on occasions quite depressing talk. 200 kilometers further north in terms of range adjustment within what, a couple of decades is that's
phenomenal.
terrifying. Yeah. That's really quite terrifying. And again, you're touching on those decisions of committed to extinction of, can we protect and some populations on the periphery that's there. But it's also really good for hearing you talking about solutions and ways forward. We've got time for one or two questions. There's an opening one. You mentioned about citizen science. If someone wanted to get involved, are there any organizations or web pages they could sign up to and go out and do surveys?
Yeah, certainly. So there's a really good app called iRecord. And the advantage of a smartphone, which people of all ages do use this, because it's very, very hard to write down your exact location, and you don't always have a GPS. So with a smartphone, you can take a photo of what it is that you've seen. The smartphone knows exactly where you are almost all the time. And all you need to do is say, I've seen this, and you send it, and it's gone. And that's great. But otherwise, you can also engage with local wildlife charities like Wildlife Trust, Northumberland Wildlife Trust near me, but others nearby, and also butterfly conservation or Botanical Society, British Isles. Yeah, lots of ways to send your records in.
Yeah, there's things you can do close to home, like the RSPB. Bird counts, which is an annual survey. There's annual butterfly counts. There's lots of options if anyone's interested. It's there. I've got a question. Basak was asking a question which you've begun to touch on a little bit, which was about changes to the physical world and the way they affect. And I think when you were talking about the re-wetting and re-establishing the upland peat bogs, is that as much about the physical stabilizing the soil and allowing the vegetation to come back? Could you say something about physical impacts of climate change and how they may affect species?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a very good point. I try to use joined up thinking as much as I could, and it's very important to join those dots. So obviously, with the movement of peat, you're talking about the wholesale exports of the soil, not just the carbon within it. And that's also a problem, because what that can start to do is create erosional gullies. Local people call them hags. These huge areas of more exposed peats, and then you get a positive feedback. So the newly exposed peat is at more risk of being eroded more quickly. And if you're not careful, you end up losing quite a lot of the hillside. We already think that we have lost a lot. And this is one of the interesting inequities between the global north and the south. In places like Britain, we've been ruining our environment in lots of creative and ambitious ways for a very, very long period of time. And that's before the satellites went up. So we don't know what we've lost in some cases. In fact, some of the best cutting edge science does come from global south, and in places, particularly tropical peats, we're understanding far more about what it does to hydrology and otherwise. So I think that's a great question.
Yeah, and if you don't stabilize the soil and the basic physical environment, you can't have the habitat, you can't have the species above. Unless brown peat is albedo, it will absorb more heat as well. So it's quite a bit disastrous. It's there. In terms of lakes and getting smaller, I presume that also reduces population and makes them vulnerable as well. Or similarly for, say, upland habitats.
Yeah, so there are lots of yeah, there are lots of so there are lots of linkages between the physical lakes and ponds being there and the species that are supported by them and that support them. That little sphagnum moss in the bottom right-hand corner, obviously sphagnum is a very speciose group of bryophyte mosses. They can hold hundreds of times their actual weight in water. And that acts as a massive kind of control valve in times of drought and things like that. So actually, across a lot of upland UK, where we see heather, we should probably also be seeing bryophytes. And if we don't see them, then there's potentially an issue of symptom of hydrological distress or decline. We're just so used to seeing it that way that we don't understand that it's a degraded system.
Yep. And I suppose as things get warmer, things get pushed, the mountain species get pushed higher and higher up the mountains until eventually there's nowhere to go. It's just too warm anywhere, and the peak, you've hit the peak, and that's
exactly. I mean,
you
might have. I discussed it briefly on the UK map of mean temperature, but yeah, things go up slope as well. The mountain ringlet is moving up slope quite quickly as well. So those are his temperature gradients acting in a different direction. Yeah.
So all these nice isolated populations with lots of walkers trampling all over them because they want to get to the top of the mountains. I've got a question here about, has any work been done on the effects of wind and increased summer cloud, particularly on pollinators or other insect groups?
Yeah, so cloudiness is a tricky one. It's very, very hard to monitor cloudiness even in lowland areas where we've got big expensive equipment that we know is still going to be there after a storm like Storm Arwen. So in montane settings, this is very, very difficult to do. I would say that would be, in particular, that would be a very fascinating thing to look into, because a priori, like without having done the work, I wouldn't know whether to expect that pollination would be easier or harder to achieve, given that species in mountain areas are obviously retracting. Because the main reason I say that is in the mountains, anyone that's been on a walk up a high mountain in one day will know this. It's very, very warm at the bottom. It's cold at the top. You've got quite a large variation in the temperature in a way that you don't have when you're on a flat piece of land, extensive flat piece of land, where the gradient, the equivalent difference in temperature from the top and bottom of a mountain is over tens or hundreds of kilometers. So actually, when you think about pollination and what's actually going on, there are lots of thermal habitats in close proximity. So I don't know whether or if or how that would be affected in the same way as it would be over the lowlands, where it's clearly having a very big impact. And like I say, part of the reason, as I talked about with the cold dwelling species at the start, we just don't have as much information about what's going on up there. It's very hard. I've sat waiting for hours on mountains for butterflies to appear with the sunshine. It's just a lot harder, and other pollinators would be the same, maybe to a less extent, dependent on the conditions.
But Andy, in lowland areas, increased windiness is meaning the butterflies aren't flying as much, and has impact. Yeah,
so there are some species that are very, very good at flying in the wind, and again, they tend to be ones like the comma that do very well when they're we call it perturbed, when they're affected into doing something differently. We tend to also find that you have more specialist species that aren't as good at flying in increased wind. But with pollinating species, so butterflies are within the Lepidoptera. The main pollinating species in the Lepidoptera group are moths, and they are good at flying. They are sensitive to wind, but to a lesser extent.
Positive news. Okay, Andy, I just noticed we're 16 minutes past, and I said we'd finish at 1:15. So thank you ever so much for the interesting talk and for taking time to answer those questions.